Well, Dan Perry is the former chairman of the Foreign Press Association of Israel, joins us live from Tel Aviv. Good to have you with us. So we've had 15 aid organizations, including groups like Save the Children, the Norwegian Refugee Council, Christian Aid amongst the 15, saying that the scale of Israeli aid obstruction is, quote, driving a humanitarian disaster. Are they right to be concerned about the siege and the disruption of aid at a time when people are facing a cold, wet winter?
I think they're absolutely right to be concerned, of course. We are clearly witnessing a very major humanitarian drama, probably a catastrophe. That's reasonable to describe it as such. Why it's happening, how to end it, who's to blame is just one of these forever Middle East disputes. And I'm not sure any of us can agree exactly on the narrative that should apply. In Israel, there's a very big debate. Everyone understands, I think, or at least most thinking people understand, that to impede the aid in any way is ethically wrong, has humanitarian implications, has reputational damage for Israel, and also legal complications. All that is indisputable. But on the other hand, Israelis say, how on earth can we continue to send aid into an area that is in a war to the finish with us? They argue, and I think correctly, that the aid is very often hijacked by Hamas, which then sells it on the black market, that drivers are afraid to go in for fear of being attacked, and that in general, the more aid they send in, the longer Hamas is able to hold out.
But clearly, Dan, sorry,
not necessarily
jump
false.
in. It's not a never-ending sort of Middle East dispute when it comes to the application of the standards of international law, right? These aid organizations, in fact, the UN Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices on November the 14th stated that through its siege over Gaza, obstruction of humanitarian aid, Israel is intentionally causing death, starvation, serious injury, using starvation as a method of war, and inflicting collective punishment. Now, a lot of countries engage in warfare, but what the UN Special Committee is saying, you don't have a right to violate international law, right?
I can't read minds, and neither can the UN Special Committee. Their intent, I strongly doubt, is to cause starvation or death. I've said this many times on your program. Their intent is to get back the hostages and to remove Hamas.
So, Dan, are you really telling the audience that the UN Special Committee is wrong and these aid agencies are wrong?
I'm telling the audience that if the UN committee can read minds in the Israeli government and army, then that is a very neat trick, and it's a scoop unlike any I've ever had in my career in journalism. What I am saying as a person who currently lives in Israel is that I know that not just the government, which is despised by at least half of Israel, but the Israeli public at large wants two things: to get back the hostages and for Hamas to no longer be in a position to attack them from Gaza. And therefore, if one is
But you don't need to starve a population in order to fight a war, right? And to try and get back hostages.
I'm telling you, I have no evidence they're intentionally trying to starve the population.
Well, that's what...
And indeed, there is no starvation in Gaza.
Well, this is what Beit Salem says. Beit Salem says that narrative is, quote, Israel has stooped so low, this is in a statement of April 2024, saying Israel has stooped so low as to try and present a false image that there was no serious nutritional crisis in Gaza. This is an Israeli human rights group.
We have here a very, very unusual situation that Israel is dealing with, in which they are trying to finish off a terrorist group that has hijacked an entire population. And aid that goes in is then taken by that terrorist group and sold on the black market. This is not a false accusation. So what to do in that situation if you're Israel is not so clear. Because I repeat, their only goal is to get back the hostages and remove Hamas. Then it wouldn't be crazy, Sammy. One sentence here. It wouldn't be crazy if we were to conclude that the way out of this, for the benefit of the Gazans, is to put maximal pressure on Hamas to give up and hand over the hostages, because then the war would be over in a second. And you would cease to be able to say that Israel's intent is to kill or starve anyone, because Israel will be doing nothing. For that to happen, Hamas has to succumb to those two conditions. And it wouldn't be completely absurd for all the good faith players in the region from Egypt and Saudi Arabia to the UAE and yes, to Qatar, to put every conceivable pressure on Hamas to stop the fight, because that is what is continuing the humanitarian disaster. And I think we all know it.
Well, Dan Perry is a former regional editor for the Associated Press. He joins me now from Tel Aviv. Dan, appreciate you coming back. So what I want to do, we talked earlier, and you made it very clear that you don't think there is starvation in Gaza. We've now heard from an Oxfam official there saying very clearly, when I asked her, she said, absolutely, yes, there is. And I appreciate your patience and engaging in this question. I think it's an important conversation for us to hear different opinions. But having heard from what that spokesperson, what that lady said, are you willing to concede, Dan, that maybe you just didn't present the right reality of what's happening in Gaza in our last interview?
No, Sammy, I'm not. And I didn't say there wasn't hunger and suffering and unbelievable misery and a totally inhuman
No, but
situation.
starvation, Dan.
I said there was, as far as I knew, no widespread and perhaps no death by starvation. That there is great hunger, that there is great suffering, that there is an inhuman situation that any one of us should bemoan is clear. So rather than getting stuck on semantics about what the meaning of starvation, let's just agree that the Palestinians in Gaza are suffering monumentally, and we should all be hoping that 2025 brings an end to the war as quickly as possible. I'm not going to deny that there is enormous suffering in Gaza. I'm not in any way here to defend the actions of the Israeli government or military. On occasion, I try to explain to you and your viewers the different versions and opinions, mine and that of others, as to who's to blame for all this. And whereas I am a huge critic of the Israeli government, huge, in the context of when I appear in Israeli media, generally that is my position, I also think that the ultimate blame for this disaster should be placed on the hands of Hamas, which is a terrorist group that has hijacked the territory and tries to cause collateral damage. And if there was death by starvation, ISS Hamas would be happy and not sad. And anything that is done to prolong the rule of these criminals over the poor people of Gaza is unwise and immoral.
All right, I haven't interrupted you, Dan. I let you go. I timed it. And I appreciate this conversation. And I don't think you're an unreasonable person, but I do have to point out some factual things. And what you said in our last interview was not that you don't think there's any deaths from starvation. You said, you repeated it twice at 10:13:30 GMT, 10:12:25 GMT. And the interview's out there. You said, indeed, there is no starvation in Gaza. And then you said also starvation. I don't think it's happening on a wide scale, if on any scale in Gaza.
What I meant to say was that as far as I knew, there was no widespread death by starvation. Now, having resolved that, let's simply agree that the situation in Gaza is a humanitarian disaster and that all efforts should be made to bring it to a swift end, and that anyone who has humanity in them must loathe the current reality and seek to end it as quickly as possible. And since I'm not responsible for the policies of the government nor military of Israel, I don't see much point in obsessing about what I said or didn't say about the definition of starvation. Rather, more useful, I think, would be to discuss how we bring an end to this catastrophe. And in that regard, I said before, and I'll say again, I think it would be extremely useful for the world and the Arab world to pressure Hamas to give up the hostages and end the war and give up power in Gaza, because my assessment is, and that's what I can usefully do here, because I'm not a food security expert, but I do know this political situation in Israel. It would be, I think we need to understand that the government of Israel, but also the people in Israel, are no longer willing to tolerate basically a war machine on their borders, digging tunnels, firing rockets, preparing to attack and invade and massacre and rape. They're not prepared to do that anymore. And I do believe that if Hamas ceased to be in charge of Gaza, that would be a favor first and foremost to the long-suffering people of Gaza. And it's great that you care about them so much, but I have friends there. I've been there many times. and I cry for what's going on in Gaza. So please, to try to portray me somehow as indifferent to the misery of the people there is an injustice.
We're going to have to leave it there because I do have the director in my ear from a while ago saying we got to wrap this up. But thank you so much. Appreciate
Thank you for
your time and engaging with these questions. Dan Perry there.